Oh, well, in narrative terms, it's simply about the fluctuating fortunes of a neo-Nazi gang of skinheads who count the streets of the western suburbs of Melbourne as their personal turf, I suppose you could say, and who clash with all sorts of people in the community, most notably members of the Vietnamese community in the West. Well, I was drawn on many levels. Dramatically, I couldn't resist it because there I saw a bunch of characters who were highly motivated, who had a specific objection to people around them. This made them uh, fantastic figures to write about. Um, and it was a controversial subject. It was worth discussing. The skinheads themselves object to, foreigners. And what is the story of the world at the moment, if not one of mass migrations of people moving throughout the world? I mean, it's what the last 2 decades of the 20th century is really all about, and that's what the conflicts are about. Uh, so I couldn't resist them from a dramatic point of view. There were characters who knew what they wanted, as warped as that was. There was a legitimate, uh, you uh, whirlpool of desires and what have you. On a visual level, it was interesting because to do justice to them dramatically, I would have to recreate the detail of their world with as much authentic bits and pieces as possible. So here were highly motivated characters who looked a certain way and behaved a certain way, brought their own music into it, and their own uniforms, and their own code of honour, if you can call it that. On another level, I was very attracted to the idea of making a film which really spat in the face of expectations about what Australian films should do, and that was irresistible too. I mean, we have a tradition in this country of doing rural stories, or if we venture into the urban areas, they're fairly soft stories, fairly sentimental. And I thought, well, this isn't really like what's going on in Melbourne or the other big centres of Australia. What's going on in some of these cities is very hard. It's hardcore. It's very gritty. It's very tough. As a as a subject of moral debate, it polarizes people. Talking about the film in retrospect because it's dealt with all this. I think there's an acceptable middle class mythology in this country. Like, for example, like as great a writer as Helen Garner is, and she is, what Helen does is no less a mythology about the bourgeois than perhaps what I attempt to do about the working class in Loverboy, for example, which was a little film I did a couple of years ago. And I guess what I'm dredging up in Romper Stomper. In other words, we accept middle class or bourgeois mythology, but we have trouble dealing with the mythology of the working class or any class outside of the middle class. And that includes the ruling classes too, I think, the ones that are really up in the dizzying heights. And we tend to view everything from this very comfortable middle class Australian perspective. So the idea of making a cult film to challenge all of that was just plain irresistible. I'm not a huge fan of cult. Like, my taste is fairly well rooted in the mainstream, strangely enough, but it just turned out that way. I mean, these things, as you're developing them and researching them, begin to take a life on of their own, and you quickly realise that if I'm going to be true to this subject, I have to sort of um, get down there with the paraphernalia and the noises and the music and the dialogue of these characters. So very quickly it evolves into a kind of culty milieu, even if you don't make that conscious decision. At the same time, I would hope that the narrative drive is quite mainstream in terms of a clearly discernible who wants what and a beginning and a middle and end and so on and so forth. We did quite a bit of research on that. Even to the point of having our actors exposed to the real McCoy. We would bring them into the production office in pre-production, have our actors sit down in a horseshoe-shaped assembly and listen to these guys. We had great faith that our actors, who have met all sorts of people in their lives, could handle this without losing their minds or becoming hopelessly corrupted. I mean, they're intelligent people as much as anything else. So they could absorb this rabid, loopy point of view and then go out and reproduce it in front of the camera, for the purposes of our film. I myself had been, sniffing around some of these groups and gangs and individuals for well over 18 months. Until it got a little bit dicey and they realised what we were on about. And I pulled out. From there on, it was a question of finding those individuals who were themselves on the way out of the gang, who were wanting to create, families, nuclear families, or who were going to leave the country or who had acquired jobs. So suddenly the gang philosophy was a backward step, as they could see it, and they didn't want to have anything more to do with it. They wanted to build their lives. So the surrogate family of the gang had become irrelevant for them, and they were going to acquire a real, family, And consequently, because they had a real family, they had real responsibilities and real concerns, and all of a sudden all the gang stuff began to fall away into the background and look rather silly. In other words, they grew up. So the individuals who were on the way out were the ones that continued to help us. But of course, they were persona non grata so far as the gangs were concerned also. A lot of them had gone overseas, so they were safe from any kind of retribution. I think it's a kind of an emotional, psychological trick of the film that you're not sure whose side you're on, because that's kind of like life. You can meet the worst, the most morally bankrupt person, but there may be a part of their life that you could sort of have some sort of empathy with. I mean, Adolf Hitler liked dogs, for example, things like that. And to deny that is to deny the three-dimensionality of the characters and to suddenly turn them into stock villains and things like that. I don't want to do that. To me, if I'd have had two-dimensional characters, that would have been an exploitation film, not what I tried to do. And once again, gets back to that question of losing that bourgeois perspective and dredging up all the detail and the sights and sounds from the centre of the gang. In other words, it was imperative that we had a view from inside the gang, not outside, because then anyone watching the film who was like that, in regards to the issues of the film, in other words, thinking, oh well, maybe the skinheads, as I read about them in the papers, have got the right handle on this. I think that they could see that there was the skinhead mythology being dredged up in the film, and yet still everything came unstuck. That any kid who felt that he wasn't sure whose side he should take or she should take in terms of this debate about migration, they could see that even from the centre of the gang, the dynamics of the gang, the cause and effect which takes place in the film would lead to its own demise. I didn't want anyone to be able to back away, some kid saying, oh, this is like a midweek problem movie on Channel 9 or something. It has nothing to do with me. It's not exciting, it's not stimulating, it's not engaging all my emotions. I can back away from this comfortably. We wanted to make a film where that was impossible, where you were compelled to watch, where the adrenaline was pumping, where you were fully engaged and yet could perceive the gang's disintegration. I challenge that term unintelligent audiences. I don't think that they really exist. I think that I leave it to people like David Stratton to use terms like impressionable young audiences. I mean, there are critics who take a kind of hierarchical point of view and say that although I am not going to be corrupted by this film, there is a danger of people out there being corrupted by this film. In other words, it's always someone else. It's never them. And they don't trust their gut feelings. In other words, Stratton, like everyone else who's seen the film, feels drained afterwards. No one, and I've mingled with thousands of people who have seen this film, no one has come up to me and said, I've seen your film, I am now stimulated to go out there and beat people up and join neo-fascist organisations. Everyone, young, old, male, female, Whether they thought the film was repulsive or compelling or whatever, everyone has said to me, I feel completely drained. I've no desire to sort of, I need a drink or a cigarette. Now, that is the reaction from everyone who's seen the film that I can gather. All you have to do is be in touch with your feelings with the film at the end to ask yourself what the film is doing, what the film is on about. There is only misunderstanding when I think people impose a kind of fake, artificial, critical criteria to the film about, how films work and things like that. The fact of the matter is that films are an emotional battleground, not an intellectual one necessarily or exclusively. And if you're honest about how you feel at the film, then you can make an honest appraisal about how dangerous the film is. In other words, it's not dangerous at all. And I would hope that every skinhead in the world sees Romper Stomper. I have no fears whatsoever about the film being taken the wrong way by, inverted commas, the wrong kind of people. It's only because we are completely authentic that we can fly under the cover of the radar of those kind of, inverted commas, dangerous people. In other words, they will accept the film at face value, and they will in turn also accept the moral dynamics of the film, which are basically that this and this leads to total destruction. It's an old story. It took place in World War II. It takes place in the course of the film. If you're at war with the whole world, the world caves in on you, and you can't win, and neither should you. It's a moral law of the universe, and when the human race realizes that it has to adapt rather than rip up the environment or people around it, when it learns that lesson, then we'll all be better off. And I think that's undoubtedly the lesson that is uncovered in the film, if you have faith in your feelings in the matter. Well, with the Vietnamese, we began with anecdotal accounts of skirmishes and clashes with the skinheads and what have you. And then it was a matter of trying to find people. I actually found it more difficult to speak with the Vietnamese than it was with the skinheads. Certainly, it was a lot less dangerous, of course, and a lot more pleasant. But after establishing a few contacts, one thing led to another, and then it came time to cast the film. And because a lot of the Vietnamese that have come to this country aren't allowed to pursue whatever skills they may have developed in their homeland or things like that, we didn't know where to turn for actors, apart from the obvious choices like Tony Lee, who had experience in miniseries on television. So we just opened the gates and asked the guys and the girls to come in and do what they could for us in front of camera, and a lot of them had never acted before. Others we discovered had vast experience. And it was great fun, and they were all excited about the film, and they thought at last here was a chance to show something that was hard and gritty. And although the film isn't about the Vietnamese, it's about the skinheads, it gave the Vietnamese a chance to, I don't know, release a bit of energy on screen rather than sort of waiting on the top of American embassies in Saigon or something like that. Here they could be shown to take kind of more positive action. And I'm proud to say that after Romper Stomper, many of them have gone on to do bits and pieces, and sometimes more than bits and pieces, on other projects and TV shows. So I think we've actually begun a few careers here. I think that's the point of the film too, that communities are galvanized and motivated by, pressures brought to bear against them. And I think that we all have to remember this, that, you bring pressure to bear against any community, whether it doesn't have to be an ethnic community, it can be a gay community or any other kind of community. And of course there's going to be a reaction, and they're prepared to use force or what have you to protect their own or whatever. So we make no apologies about that. And I think that one of the messages in the film is that the skinheads have put up together a kind of surrogate family that functions as best it can, but doesn't cope with the realities of its situation. The Vietnamese greater family or community does, but the skinheads constantly underestimate the complexity of what they're trying, what they're up against or what they're trying to do, simply because fascism is a simplistic solution. It doesn't work. That's why the Third Reich disintegrated in 1945. It was, politically, morally, and militarily bankrupt. It didn't have any answers on any level. It was a lame-brained way to solve the problems of Central Europe, and it remains a lame-brained way to solve any problems. It doesn't work. And the fact that fascist governments may rise but invariably fall, I think that, well, everybody should remember that. They simply don't work. There's no longevity in them. There is a futility to what the skinheads are on about. Here I have a group of upwardly socially mobile Japanese who have the wealth and the wherewithal to visit a foreign country. The skinheads don't have this capacity. The Japanese are highly successful economically, and they're touring Australia, they're touring the coastal areas, and they have ironically witnessed the end of this miserable skinhead gang. What I'm saying in that scene is that the world is now, questions about race are really irrelevant. It's economic power which decides who we are and what we are in relationship to each other. And the skinheads may delude themselves into thinking that they can look down on the Vietnamese, but there's no way they can, be honest about any attempt to look down on the Japanese. The Japanese are better than them economically, and that is the salient point. So I put the Japanese on a cliff top looking down at the skinheads. And it is a reference back to the simplicity, the childish simplicity of this idea of inherent racial superiority. It is also, I think, indicative of, as you say, the futility of what the skinheads are on about. I don't see anything to apologise for in the scene. I know some people are a bit concerned that it's racist, but what is really happening here? You've got to ask yourself, what is actually happening? I have a bunch of happy Japanese tourists who happen to have cameras. They see a burning car, they get out, they take photographs, and they drift over to the edge of the cliff to see what's going on. If I had a camera, if I was in a bus and I saw a burning car in a foreign country, I would take pictures too. That is precisely what I would do. I would be curious, and I would wander over to the cliff to see what was going on. I think, here, there, and other places, there are people that have a knee-jerk response to certain things. Like, the question of race is very difficult. The whole issue is difficult to discuss because there are rabid racists and there are, well-meaning liberals that have their own knee-jerk responses. Neither one is correct. You have to be able to buy into the rough and tumble of all of this. You have to be able to have the wherewithal to discuss it openly and robustly. And you can't be afraid to show images of people getting off buses and things like that. You just can't do it. Some people have argued that it's cliched, but if you go down to that part of Victoria, there are the Japanese. That is what they do. I'm sorry, that's it. That's what they do, and that's what they look like. And the Japanese in Toronto that have witnessed the film had a smile on their face. They accepted this quite happily. Davey and Gabe demonstrate some capacity for intimate commitment. And I think that intimate commitment is the beginning of the end for big, sweeping political plans to change the face of humanity or your environment, things like that. I think that the problems in people's lives are never solved by big political programs. The major problems in your life, or some problems certainly are, like clothing, hunger, things like that. But the problems that nag you when you get out of bed, or you're on the tram coming down to the city, or you're going to work, the things that annoy you in the middle of the night at 3 a.m, they're not solved by big sweeping plans for everyone. They're solved by little plans for yourself, solving your own idiosyncratic problems and your needs as an individual human being. The only way you can find happiness is to sort of do your own thing, be an individual. That's the end of gangs. It's the end of big, dangerous political movements. It's the beginning of the end. It's the death knell for all the things that we hate. You know, monolithic blocks and vicious groups and you know, race hatred and all that sort of stuff. So in a very real sense, yeah, I think love does conquer all. But by love, I mean a capacity for intimate commitment to another person, or a capacity for introspection, for reflection, to their own self be true. And I think that the problem with skinheads and other racists is that they choose to take out, you know, their personal problems on the world. They don't address their personal problems unto themselves. They think, oh, I have a personal problem, but I'm going to take it on the world. I cannot change myself, so I'm going to change the whole world. Well, you can't do that, you know. Say that these people come from Mars, that they're that separate from us. I mean, everyone at some stage or other, and I'm talking about of any race in this country, has demonstrated, you know, some little bit, sometimes more than a bit, of racism. It's, alas, part of human nature to categorise and divide people up into groups. And of course, if there are racial differences, you know, in visual terms, then that makes the categorisation process all the much easier to execute. So, yes, I mean, ladies and gentlemen, when we see the skinheads out there, let's not forget ourselves, because they're, I think if we're honest with ourselves, we've all had our moments when we've thought or said or done this or that and the other, and we know darn well that we shouldn't have. So yes, I would hate to think that the skinheads were taken as complete aliens. They're not. They're human beings, and they are part of this country. As I looked at proof and I thought to myself, there beneath this friendly dishwashing exterior beats the heart of a very passionate individual. And I thought this could be the man to play Hando. And Russell certainly proved that. Russell was ready for a role which could make use of all of his, you know, acting resources. And we were very happy with what he did. And I don't think that there's anyone in Australia who could have done a better job than Russell. I was so pleased with the fact that we could cast Russell and ultimately what he did for the film. Jackie, I had not seen Jackie, and she hadn't done any film work or television work, but we'd heard about Jackie up in New South Wales, and we tested her, and we thought he was an actress with the courage, um, and the intelligence to get a handle on Gabe's role. It was a very difficult role, and I must say there are many good actresses around that I think were a little bit afraid to take it on. But Jackie, to her credit, had the courage and the fortitude to grab the bull by the horns and just do the job, and she did it magnificently. And it is with great regret that she didn't get a nomination in the AFI Awards. I think perhaps there may have been a little bit of a payout at the fact that she was seen to be a party to what was a very complex female role that I agree, you know, does not go along with, it's not a role model for women. And I think there may have been a bit of a reaction to what Jackie did and was asked to do. But we were so pleased with what she did, and no one, again, could have done it better. There was a very talented young actor who had an enormous future ahead of him and died under tragic circumstances. So it's a story. It's news. And it's foolish to think that you can just cover this up or walk away from it. I knew Daniel for 4 years before he died, and I had a lot of dealings with him. I counted him as a friend. I didn't see much of him in the last months preceding his death, but we had a lot to do with him, Daniel Shaft, the producer, and I, you know, before that. As you know, I worked with him on Loverboy, and we were so impressed with what he did in Loverboy, even though it was a small role, we wanted to groom him and bring him along with a role with more responsibility. He was a friend of Ben Mendelsohn and Noah Taylor, and we thought he was at least equal in ability to those fellas. And we thought here in our midst was a guy who could do anything. He was instinctively brilliant. He engaged his body, his face, everything. He wasn't just a talking head. He was much better than being a talking head on a soapy. This guy could use his whole body in a very taxing role on the big screen. And Daniel and I are just pleased that we could put him in a film and display his talents before his horrors and demons caught up with him and overtook him. We wanted to make it at various points a bit like the 6 o'clock news. You know, your roving reporter caught in the middle of a riot or what have you. There's nothing like cinema verite to sort of put you right in there. It was difficult to conceive of anything else as exciting as that under the circumstances. There was also an enormous economic advantage in that it was a fairly low budget film, and we were using Super 16, which we blew up to a 35mm print. So what you're seeing is on 35, but what was shot was on Super 16, which meant that our gear was extremely light and very portable, which means we could literally throw the camera around at will, which was an advantage in terms of the style of the film. So it was a device as much as direct intention born out of necessity, but it worked in our favour all the way. And Mr. Ron Hagen is one of the great exponents of that kind of camera work. So we had the best man for the job for that. Fantastic. I think to myself, well, I'm taking kind of kitchen sink subjects and putting them in on this classical trajectory. And I think the statement I'm trying to make with that operation is that the working class deserves better, and the subjects caught up in the working class deserve better than a simple, naturalistic, humdrum kind of, you know, narrative trajectory. That there are great passions, great drama, and great vaulting ambition in the suburbs that for some reason this country refuses to acknowledge. We may acknowledge it to our high flyers, you know, in the property boom or something like that, but we don't see it in the quiet desperation, as it were, of everyday life in the suburbs. Now, okay, I'm dealing with, you know, everyday life of skinheads, and in Loverboy it was the everyday life of a 16-year-old. But it's the passions that churn within, you know. And as I said before, you know, my characters are the products of Australian society. They don't come from Mars. So why not give them a classical trajectory? Some lives are simply like that, and it could be your neighbour has a certain classical trajectory to their life. I mean, the fact is that trajectory might take 10, 15, 20 years, but it's there nonetheless. Of course, in a feature film, you have to compress time and get things done in an hour and a half to 2 hours. So you make a few compromises to tell the story, you know. But no, I make no apologies for that, the classical line which does appear in my work. And it's all part of my stand that the working class and the subjects that I find in the suburbs deserve better than what they've got. Mean subjects don't necessarily have to be treated meanly in terms of a narrative, you know, trajectory. When you get to know a person, you get to know the story of their life and what they've lost, what they hope to gain, and you're often very surprised, aren't you, about your neighbour's ambitions, often very surprised. And in fact, ladies and gentlemen, you can be surprised about your own ambitions if you're honest about yourself. So all I'm saying is there is no such thing as the ordinary person. We're all extraordinary. We're all idiosyncratic. So this idea of presenting ordinary people in mundane, ordinary, easygoing ways to me is junk, dramatically worthless, and tells you nothing, because we all have, you know, big plans for ourselves on some level or other, or we may have discarded those plans, or we may be dreaming of the day when we do have those plans. But there's a bit of drama in the life of every individual. It's simply a question of looking. And if you don't find it, you're not looking hard enough.